For our next session, I'd like to introduce Boris Power, technical staff member at OpenAI, Alex Weibel, research fellow at Zoom and professor at Carnegie Mellon, Percy Leong, associate professor at Stanford and co-founder at Together.xyz, Brian Krautz, technical staff member at Anthropic, and finally, Vijay Narayanan, general partner at Fellows Fund, who will be moderating the session on navigating the AI landscape.
All right, welcome everyone to this panel, probably the most exciting panel of the day because we named it similar to the title of the summit itself. It's really about navigating the AI landscape, open or closed, hopefully with our eyes open. And really, if I think about it, over the last 3 years, generative AI has advanced very rapidly. And in the first year or so, a lot of these advances, the technological innovations, the model architectures, and sometimes the models themselves were published in the open domain. There were publications, there were models that were open sourced. But in the last couple of years, we have seen that increasingly many of the innovations, the architectures, the models, the innovations are starting to be only accessible behind closed APIs, delivered by companies like OpenAI, Microsoft, Anthropic, et cetera. Simultaneously, as a reaction probably to this development, we have seen a large number of new startups, starting to take the other approach of launching things in open source. So Stability AI, DALL-E from Databricks, more recently the Red Pajama models from Together have all started coming in open source as well. So clearly there is a dichotomy emerging now between these two ecosystems, an open source ecosystem for generative AI and a closed source ecosystem for generative AI. So the panel today is really about how do we as users closer? Okay. How do we as users, companies, developers, how do we think about how to navigate this landscape of both the closed and the open source ecosystems for generative AI? It doesn't have to be necessarily one or the other. It could be a combination of both as well. So with that, I would like to, and the ecosystem itself goes way beyond just the foundation models themselves, right? We need a lot of tools, frameworks, and processes for managing these models, for measuring the values of these models, for understanding the copyright issues, processes, and governance of these models. So there's a lot of other tools and frameworks we need in order to be able to leverage these generative AI innovations. So this panel today will shed light on I'm hoping that the panelists will really help us shed light on a number of questions related to this topic. With that, I wanted to just quickly introduce the panelists. It's a very distinguished panel. To my immediate left is Dr. Alex Weibel. Alex is a computer science faculty at CMU and at Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. He's been a long-time researcher in speech recognition, translation, and leveraging neural networks very extensively in a number of these areas. He's also one of the first, to my knowledge, to invent time delay neural networks into this field. So welcome, Alex. To the left of Alex is Brian Krush. Brian is a member of technical staff at Anthropic, working on productizing a lot of the models coming out of Anthropic. He has founded 2 companies before, so he has been a twice entrepreneur in the past. And he has also worked in Facebook and Stripe, among a number of other places. Welcome, Brian. And to the left of Brian is Boris Power. So Boris leads an applied AI team at OpenAI, which really is pushing the boundaries of how do you solve real-world problems using the technologies developed by OpenAI. He's also an advisor to the OpenAI Fund. He holds an AI degree from the University of Edinburgh, and he has worked as a software engineer, data scientist, and machine learning engineer in the past. Welcome, Boris. And on the far left, we have Percy, who needs no introduction. But I just wanted to add a couple of things to Janelle's introduction of Percy in this morning. Percy has been a very long-term proponent of reproducibility in machine learning research. So for those of you know, he is the inventor of the Coda Lab worksheets, which really brought in large-scale reproducibility and brought in a lot of tools for reproducibility into machine learning. Specifically for this panel, he's also a co-founder of the company Together.xyz that has a stated mission of making available large-scale open-source generative AI models as cloud services to all of us. So welcome, Percy. So it's a very distinguished panel we have today, and I just wanted to start with a very simple question. Really would love to hear, gentlemen, your thoughts on, given this, how should the users, right? So the different companies, whether they are enterprises, whether they are startups, large ones, small ones, enterprise ones, consumer ones, how should we be really thinking about leveraging what's coming out of both the open and the closed source ecosystem for generative AI? Percy, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and I'm very happy to be here again. I think this is really an important and interesting question, closed or open. And I would say that it's a spectrum, and it's actually multidimensional, so I don't want to think about this as sort of some sort of fundamental dichotomy either. I think my recommendation is that, as has been said multiple times, this field is moving incredibly quickly. What is the best model today might be supplanted by some other model right now. And I think if you're building applications downstream, it's important to build them in a bit of a future-proof way. And fortunately, a lot of the models are interoperable and almost interoperable or behave similarly. And I think the crucial thing is to think about these models as each one has a certain cost and has certain performance characteristics. Again, this is why stress benchmarking is very important, because things move quickly, and what might be the best decision right now might not be the best decision later. And only through rigorous benchmarking can you make the intelligent decisions whether to switch. And you want, right now, I think, the switching cost to be relatively low, because needs change over time. And furthermore, I think that we shouldn't think about these models as static entities. I think one of the benefits of thinking about the open source ecosystem is how rapidly things get adapted. Things, for example, the Pajama data set that we put out, I don't remember, maybe it was 3 weeks ago, which feels like eternity. Within 24 hours, someone had already been training models on that data set. And I looked at Hugging Face earlier today. There's 50 models that are trained on that data set, and that number is probably increased. And not only that, there's other companies who have mixed that data set with other data sets and are training additional models based on their particular needs, not to mention, once you have base models, all the fine-tuning work that can be done. So you think about this as a kind of whole ecosystem where these assets that get produced and people can and take and mix and match, sort of much like how software is done. I think software obviously is much more mature than the foundation models ecosystem, but I think that might be a useful metaphor to think about how we kind of manage, make decisions going forward.
Thank you. Boris and Brian would especially love to hear your thoughts on this, because you're both part of companies that are offering closed source generative AI behind APIs. So how should you think, I mean, how do you think companies should be thinking about this?
Yes, maybe I'll kick off. So I think OpenAI both open sources some models and serves other models through closed source. And my team in particular has open sourced 2 different repositories. One, which is OpenAI evals, which makes it easier to do auto evals of more complex capabilities, which are not just, which can't be simply assessed via rule-based approaches. And the OpenAI cookbook, which is a repository that shows the best practices for how to use these models. So I also agree that there is an ecosystem here that we would all love to see develop, and I think that ecosystem should be a combination of both people using open source or closed source models, whatever works best for their use case. But I think one big benefit of closed source models that are served through an API is that we are seeing so many people who previously haven't done anything in machine learning space, but are extremely creative, who are able to build these incredible applications and iterate incredibly quickly. So I think really what we're seeing is a birth of a full stack engineer as being a very capable single person company that can create many different possible product ideas and then see what sticks, and then as soon as something sticks, then focus or double down on that.
Can I chime in here? I think there's APIs is sort of orthogonal access. You can have APIs for closed or open source models. I completely agree with the power of APIs because it makes, you don't have to stand up a huge model yourself. But I think that's sort of an orthogonal point.
Yeah, I much to that point, I think of it on kind of 2 different axes. One is the safety axis, which has been a lot of my personal focus lately. And I think closed source models offer a lot more tools towards safety. You've seen with open source models the ability to kind of remove various safety checks with relatively little effort. And so if we're kind of in this space of quick moving and still trying to, as a community, wrap our head around safety to the level of comfort that I know a lot of us want, closed source just gives us a lot more tools in the tool belt. And so, clearly in the long term, having safety mostly built into the models where the model and the model weights itself layers in a lot of those things that we want is ideal. But until then, I think there will be a lot of layering of safety on top through, extra queries or, various other mechanisms to try and make things safe. So I think open does have the risk of the more models that are out there, the easier it is for people to hoist them up and abuse them. Though, of course, there are a lot of positives to that as well.
Maybe if we can just jump in around safety. I think safety is a word that's kind of used for many different purposes. And I think many people misunderstand why companies are doing this. Safety is really not censorship. And as these models get more and more powerful, the dangers will get higher and higher. It sort of reduces the amount of money or effort that somebody needs to cause real world harm. And it's not about necessarily just the models themselves being dangerous in a sort of sci-fi scenario. It's humans using models to do worse things. And there is an argument that maybe the models that are out there today aren't as powerful, but I think even with GPT-4, that already kind of starts blurring the lines. GPT-4 is superhuman on a number of different problems, especially when it comes to combining knowledge from multiple domains that you can hardly find in a single person. So we are just going to want to distinguish safety from simple content moderation and then also kind of more dangerous capabilities as well.
Maybe I can chime in here. I think safety is actually multifaceted. Maybe the top level distinction I would make is between sort of accidents and misuse, right? There are people who are well-intentioned, maybe slightly careless, who want to do the right thing. And for those, but might screw up and deploy something that they was not safe. I think for those cases, it's actually open source is actually great because the open community, the majority of people are good. We should build as a community tools to do basically safety checks, detect bias, content moderation, and so on, with the benefit of these controls being open and auditable, and as long as the best practices are established and it's easy for people to do the right thing, I think people more or less do the right thing. I think the second category of misuse is perhaps I think a little bit more challenging to deal with. I don't think this is maybe unsurmountable. I think for misuse, I think there is a a trade-off between, well, if you put it out, well, people can use it. I mean, I think this is just the nature of dual-use technology that we have to, confront, right? Even with internet or social media, there are things you can do which are good and bad. And then the question is, where do you, control? For example, you can make laws that ban certain types of behaviors, regardless of whether it's coming from generative AI models or a human doing it. And so it's an open question, I think, to be for the misuse categories where regulation and what kind of precautions need to be taken. But for the vast majority of people who are trying to do the right thing, I think open source can be very safe because you can have the open community develop these safety controls.
Yeah. That's a great point. I think there's kind of two questions at hand here. One is, in terms of the community as a whole, is it better to push towards developing open models or closed models, and where should the community as a whole go? And then for operators and people who are trying to integrate AI into their companies, is it better for them to use the current open or closed options? I think the former is a much larger debate versus the practicality of what you as founders and leaders do today.
Thank you, gentlemen.
I'm curious.
Alex, I do wanted to get your thoughts on this. Earlier when we were chatting, you brought up this point about, hey, it doesn't have to be closed or open. There's a spectrum in between. There's partly closed, partly open.
Yeah, I think the practical reality is also that there are other factors that impinge on all this, because if you're totally closed, clearly if you're interested in making money, every company has to make money. So, and the fact of the matter is, when money is at stake, people tend to do things closed because you can sell stuff. On the other side, I just came from Germany yesterday, where people are just itching to regulate the heck out of all of this because, if you're a hospital in Germany, it's just simply a non-starter to send any data to the US to some server to do stuff there, right? So there's a lot of discussion on having their own solutions and having different providers or different even government efforts to create large language models, etc. That generates, of course, worldwide a huge duplication of effort and isn't really going anywhere in terms of solving the underlying safety issues and so on you mentioned. So my question is it possible to have it half open? Because if we managed as a community to modularize what language models do better, we might not be that scared, as we are now. We're all, buying FFT routines or basic routines, and we don't find them scary and it doesn't really bother me if they're provided by someone that I can buy, and if there's some aspects of language models that can be modularized so that they can in fact be licensed to run on-premise in some location, doesn't have to go through any servers. I think there may be solutions in between. I think we're seeing some of this. For example, in speech, we use these language models that just do, it's not language models in that case, it's just encoding of speech vectors. And in language models, I'm sure you can do this to some extent also, where you mix a public persona or a public model with something that's very private and personal, and you combine them. So in other words, what I'm advocating is some kind of federated learning, where you have a distributed learning where it gets really private and has to be secure, from something that the provider can produce in a commoditized AI that is essentially provided by someone. And I think in that case, you might get your best of both worlds, where someone is providing a service that you buy, and there is no loss of control and trust because the sensitive part is done somewhere else in your private language model, if you will, and you combine the two. I think it's technically feasible. It's a bit speculative still, but I think eventually we'll probably be forced to move in a direction like that, simply for regulatory forces and pressures.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating point. I think we have seen a lot of market demand for at least more control over your data. I know OpenAI and Anthropic both have, they have their foundation models, and we have our Bedrock partnership with AWS. So at least insofar as hosting in the cloud, which gives a better confidence in data privacy. It's something that both companies are actively exploring. I tend to treat kind of open versus closed as, can you get the model weights? Once you have model weights, the cat's out of the bag, and people can start doing, RL on top of them to make them operate differently, and you just lose a huge amount of control. But the idea of everything up to that or around that being open is fascinating.
So maybe if I can, sorry, Percy, did you want to add to that?
Oh, I was just going to jump in. Again, I want to emphasize that it's a very multi-dimensional space. I think the model weights are one thing. There is also, data is another thing, or even documentation about the data. I think there are things which are, there's benefits to openness, and there's obviously competitive dynamics and other sorts of safety reasons for close. And I think we have to think about kind of a menu where you select, make different decisions, and not just think about open or close. One thing I think would be nice if there were more transparency on the data that's going into training these models, especially with the issues around maybe copyright or different types of liability. And if you can imagine some of applications which are maybe for children education, you want to be extra sure that these models have some sort of properties. The fact that Bing Chad, aka Sydney, sort of went off the rails a little bit was kind of interesting to see how the safety that was on top maybe was, there is some safety, but underlying it is, God knows what. So I think more transparency about what is happening, just like for many other things, we, for example, in the food industry, we demand to know where our food is coming from, whether it's organic, whether it's fair trade. I think similar almost nutrition labels or specification on materials would be very helpful for the vast majority of us who are downstream of the model developers.
Yep. So Percy, just drilling on that, what kind of transparencies should users, developers, should they demand or expect any model provider, whether closed or open source, to really provide and stand behind? Is there any framework? Do we have any existing things? I mean, a few years ago, I think Google introduced model sheets as sort of an example. I mean, to take a stab at this. Can you folks elaborate about where we are today and going forward, what we can expect from these foundational model providers?
Yeah, I can start and others can chime in. I think the question of what a downstream developer or user should demand of upstream model developers, I think there's a few things. One is, at the very bare minimum, some sort of specification. This is a product. What does a product do? What can it do? What it can't do? The performance characteristics. I think there are some the usage policies, I think, do specify at a very high level, here are the things that it can do, and maybe, but I think we can go farther and push for more specificity. For example, it can do question answering, but in what language and what domain. And I think, again, this relates to benchmarking, having much more complete description of the performance characteristics. If you think about, if you buy electronic parts, it will have the whole spec sheet with this can sustain temperatures up to 200 Celsius or whatever. I think we need to develop industry standards around specifying the behavior of these models. And then the other thing is, sort of in the reverse arrow, is what happens when something goes wrong. What is the plan for recourse? Is there a way that downstream users can demand that, this is broken, how can we get it fixed, to complete the picture? Because there, unlike many things, we know that LLMs have many defects in them, and we're all very honest and pull up any evaluation, you can find problems with it. but which is expectation setting. But then what do you do about that? How can downstream users provide feedback and ensure that this feedback will actually be taken to improve the model? And the third thing is what I said earlier about the process at which these models are built. What data were they trained on? Were they trained on pirated books? Hopefully not. Were they trained on very offensive material? I don't know. What was the labor that was used? Just like kind of the fair trade thing. Who are the people who produced the data set? I think having some more documentation and transparency of that would be great for the health of the ecosystem.
That's great. Boris, just following up on that. So I think OpenAI had this very interesting journey where they started out as very fully transparent and open and publishing everything. And then over the last year and a half, they've increasingly pushed a lot of these things behind closed APIs, right? Could you walk us through what really led to that change in direction and why OpenAI is like taking that route?
Of course. Yeah, I think OpenAI very genuinely believes that we are getting closer to artificial general intelligence and superintelligence. And as we get closer, the standards need to get higher. So I think when GPT-2 was released, it was released open source. And then with GPT-3, we released it closed source with some information around how it was trained. And with GPT-4, there was a paper that released kind of the model specifications, but not as much about the training details or the weights. So I think what went into these decisions is that as these models get more capable, it's much more important that we make sure that the safety is up to the standards that it can be, and serving it through an API, we can understand what can be done and what can't be done with these models. And before we release the model, we don't have a very good understanding of how powerful these models are. So the only way that we think is reasonable to approach this problem is to go with a gradual deployment where we see slowly what happens. And I think the Overton window over what's dangerous and not is shifting constantly. And OpenAI is attacked from both sides, from the side of we are being too open, too fast, and also from the other side, which is the open source side, which is we're not releasing enough information. I think it's important to look ahead, and I don't know, would you personally say that like we should definitely open source the weights to GPT-5, 6? Does that pose real world dangers? Is that a responsible thing to do? And also, does that lead to acceleration risks? Because then suddenly everyone else might want to start training exactly the same models with exactly the same technology and trying to be faster and outcompete, and then leads to competitive dynamics that may result in much less safety overall with these models.
Alex, you had some thoughts.
Yeah, I find some of the discussion a bit naive because, it's few companies now thinking about how they can create a morality that will work for everyone on the planet under closed doors, and that's just not going to work. The regulators, even in the United States, there is just so much disagreement on politics that, if you have answers. So, the ChatGPT and other models already have things where they refuse to answer. There was a second question I asked ChatGPT, which was the better president? And you get, of course, this kind of, I don't know, but this was hand programmed, right? I think we need to think about having trainable moralities because different parts of the world will think differently. I mean, your attitude towards food was mentioned, or different things will be very different in Europe and in US and China. And dealing with these issues inside one company was a mistake in social media, and I think it's going to happen again in large language models if we're not careful. So I think we really need to worry about how to formulate the problem of morality in a way that becomes specifiable locally and trainable locally, so that people can create their own ecosystem. and provide guardrails that they want to make sure is ensured in their environment, right? Because it will differ in different parts of the world. And so I think, and it's doable, I believe, because we need to somehow figure out ways in which we can impose restrictions, like you already do, right? You have something, oh, if you ask about Trump and Biden, just don't answer, right? We can do this interactively, right? You can have interactive ways in which language models refuse to provide service if you're touching on things that are taboo, right? Question of Taiwan, I'm sure, or the question of Ukraine. I mean, you name it, there are touchy points, depending on where you are on this planet, where you need to be careful and your language model needs to respond accordingly. And so I think we need to be able to, again, modularize this and localize it, because the language model is only as good as we will provide quality. I mean, first he talks about measuring the quality, right? But the quality is local, it's sometimes subjective, and so we need to have a mechanism of modularizing such that you have specificity and locality in different places. And for that, you need to modularize this in some sense.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And I think the default world is companies try to become the arbiters of truth, and hopefully we have
That's
learned.
a disaster, right?
Yeah, hopefully we have
know
learned
that,
from the failings of social
You don't want to
media.
be in that situation, right?
Yeah, I do think that the progress towards that needs to be commensurate with the safety technology. And I think while there's a lot of research going on, I just think until we have the ability to do that in a safe way and start to provide those levers, leading towards close just gives you more overall safety. But if you hold on to that too long, as companies often do, you end up being social media.
It's a common misconception that things are hand-programmed in. It's not that we hand-program anything like there's a regex that catches Trump or Biden and does something special with it. This comes from the fears and dangers around the political campaign misinformation and being able to generate that at scale.
Yeah, of
And also,
course.
the other thing that we agree on, which is I think we believe that the bounds should be set by what the user wants. The user should be able to set what their preferences are. But we still believe that there should be kind of very, very broad as possible, societal bounds of what's the level of acceptability. And then within that, the user should be able to specify what's their worldview, what are their values, and how do they want to interact with this entity.
Yeah, but
So
it's
just
very
to
complex.
press on that a bit,
Yeah.
where does that come from? I know it's not a regular expression, but the data of how do you answer this question has to come from somewhere, and it's either annotators or some sort of constitutional specification or user feedback. And I think there's a sort of general sense that, well, we're aligning to human values, but whose values are these? So, can you say actually a little bit more about how does, if you ask Trump or Biden, where does that decision came from?
Yeah, and let me just jump in. And this is such a trivial example, right? Because your question can be much more complex and you wouldn't know, and your morality is even a hierarchy of complex issues, right? There was this wonderful interview on Gizmodo on this ChatGPT lying on because of the and then saying it was doing the blind. You all heard this, right? About the blind man. It's doing the captures, right? You know the story. It went it went viral because ChatGPT was lying, pretending that it was not a bot, it was a blind person trying to do the captures, and then the interviewer suggested, I would never lie to be a blind person just to solve a capture. And if you think about this hierarchy of morality, that there are certain things we as humans are willing to lie over and certain things that we're not. It's not just Biden and Trump. There's just a whole hierarchy of things hiding behind it, which need to be learned.
Just in the interest of time, if I may step back a little bit, I think we have about 5 minutes from now.
Yeah.
So if each of you can just share very quickly, what do you think? I mean, we talked about a lot of challenges, right? So what do you think are going to be the top 2 or 3 challenges, research challenges that we need to get right in these foundation
So
models?
let me just maybe comment exactly following on this. I think we need to find a mechanism of making trainable moral guidelines that make that more automatic and local. And I think that's doable. That would be my vote.
Brian?
the challenges. I think safety as a whole is a huge challenge. And I think this ties into, like you said, morality. Like the safest AI is one that refuses to answer any questions, but that's also not helpful. So we're not going to train that. And so,
Well, you could make it interactive, right? Could ask a question.
yes. Then so there's a lot of nuance in what it means to be safe and how you get safety. And I think one, that needs to be built into the models, and two, we need to figure out how to operate that in the real world. A safe model in a lab is not necessarily a safe model in the real world, and people do crazy things out there. And so figuring out how to layer on, much in a modular way, as you said, how to layer on safety, both built into the models and wrapped in the ecosystem around it, I think is a huge challenge.
Let me add watermarking, by the way, to my list of challenges.
Safety and watermarking.
Yeah, because at some point you want to know, is this a bot or is it where does this come from, right?
So having
Working
some
on it.
provenance and
What's that?
provenance and traceability of
Yes.
models.
Potentially, I think there are ethical and philosophical questions on that. I think it's a very good idea, but I think it also needs research.
Boris?
I think, how do we create the incentives such that there is no race to the bottom with regards to safety with everyone? How do we coordinate between different research labs, different countries, internationally? How do we establish governance around what values should be in these models, and also what do we think is the reasonable risk that we want to go ahead with? And I think the regulatory challenges around that as well.
I'm personally interested in thinking about a different paradigm for how all of this could work. In the sense that right now the paradigm is we have organizations which gather data from the internet, maybe supplemented with annotations, train a large model, whether it be closed or open, and deploy it to users, right? This is the world that we're used to, but this doesn't have to be the world. I think of Wikipedia. Everyone loves Wikipedia, right? And I think of this as actually a really good example of something that really shouldn't exist. Like, why does it work? You could think that, I guess, Britannica and all these were the kind of right ways, more centralized ways of creating knowledge. And Wikipedia was, some crazy, experiment, and with decentralization. And think about it. This is the world's knowledge base, but anyone can go and edit it and change it. And the edits are, and of course you build safety on top of this ecosystem, right? You can't just have it complete free-for-all. There's strict governance. But fundamentally, it is an open ecosystem, and it's been remarkably successful and stable. I'm surprised that it's so good, despite this fear that you would have 20 years ago, and maybe you still have, that anyone can go and vandalize and screw up, and then we would have tons of disinformation. So now LLMs are different, so I'm not saying that we just do Wikipedia and we're done, but I think it's important to remember that this is very early stage. We just discover flight or fire, electricity, whatever you have, what your favorite analogy is. We have existence proof that certain capabilities are possible. And now we need to think about, how do we want this technology to develop in society? How should people contribute to it? How should the profits and value be shared across people? And how do you keep it safe? And I think these are vastly open questions. And I think we are in a local optimum where I think it's fundamentally, there's this trade-off between open and closed and safety and transparency, which maybe if we just step back and kind of redesign the system, we would be in a different spot. And I want to emphasize that, again, it's not this if you think of open or closed, you're choosing between two things. I think it's a false dichotomy. And I don't know how to do this. I mean, this is what I think about this is what academia, I think, should be thinking about, the next wave of how do you architect these, socio-technical systems. But I think, this is going to be a big deal, and I want to make sure, we should all make sure that this technology is adopted and developed in a way that benefits us all.
Thank you, Percy. Unfortunately, in the interests of time, I think we will have to wrap up by now. Alex, do you want to have a last
I
word?
think I just wanted to second that and maybe follow up with the thing. I think we need greater research on plausibility and confidence metrics, not just performance, because we can maybe get performance up to 95%. That's still, in speech recognition, we have the same problem, or language translation. It's always that poison cookie, that last 1% that hurts. But if we knew where that 1% was, we can work around that as humans, and we want to be involved as humans, I would say.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a very enlightening panel today. And with that, we'll wrap it up. So thank you, everyone. And,